This podcast is intended for a mature audience over 19 years of age and is provided on an educational and informational basis. Any material presented is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as a substitute for professional medical advice or as an endorsement or medical claim by Everything Podcast or Ripco.pro.
As the cannabis industry grows, it's looking for ways to innovate. Not just how to deliver and consume cannabis products, but right at the start, from the roots, how to grow the plant greener and more sustainably.
Growing cannabis has always been a marriage of old school cultivation and new wave technology, hands in the dirt and high-end LED lighting. It's only gotten more creative as time's gone by. In this case, they're keeping it natural. They're using fish. This season on the podcast, we talked with Kayla Mann briefly about growing cannabis and salmon in the same system. Now it's time for the deep dive. Everything you wanted to know. 2 products from one farm. It's called aquaponics. By growing and using the waste of the coho salmon as fertilizer for the plants, the BC-based cannabis producer Habitat Life is able to grow really good and really environmentally friendly cannabis.
We spoke to 2 of the guys who built Habitat into the symbiotic circular farming environment it is today. This kind of innovation goes hand in hand with the changing attitudes and culture surrounding cannabis. It comes from the need to work with the resources available and around restrictions from back in the day. But when those restrictions ease up or go away, we get to see some real creativity. I'm Don Schaefer.
I'm Ross Rebagliati. This is the Potcast.
But first, while aquaponics is revolutionizing how we grow cannabis sustainably, there's a lot happening in cannabis culture and policy around the world. So let's dive into the pot news. In California, you'll soon be able to go into a cafe, listen to live music, order food, drinks, and cannabis. Governor Gavin Newsom has signed a bill that will allow cannabis retailers to turn into cannabis cafes. These establishments were first popularized in Amsterdam. As it stands now in the state, retailers are only allowed to sell prepackaged, non-cannabis infused food and drinks like candy and water. Governor Newsom vetoed a similar bill last year over concerns for public health. This iteration contains amendments that address those concerns. They include requiring cafes to post warnings about cannabis consumption on site, to have secondhand smoke and workplace hazard evaluations, and for local governments to consider building ventilation and filtration when permitting cafes. By the way, this law goes into effect January 1st. Plenty of people like to enjoy cannabis with others. In British Columbia, there's already a law that allows smoking and vaping cannabis on public patios where smoking is already permitted, subject to local or indigenous government bylaws and other rules. With changes to the cannabis control regulation, licensees are able to promote a place to consume cannabis or to spend time after consuming cannabis. However, consuming cannabis in cannabis stores is still not allowed. United States Vice President Harris says she backs legalizing marijuana. On a sports and culture podcast, Harris said she thinks we've come to a point where we have to understand that we need to legalize it and stop criminalizing this behavior. And she also feels strongly that people shouldn't go to jail for smoking weed. Harris hasn't always felt this way. She's been criticized in the past for aggressively prosecuting marijuana-related crimes. Back when she was San Francisco's district attorney and California's attorney general, and was against Proposition 19, the failed ballot measure to legalize marijuana in 2010. But as senator, Harris co-sponsored legislation to end the federal prohibition of marijuana and has since called for expunging nonviolent marijuana-related criminal offenses. Her current position to legalize cannabis is stronger than President Biden's and even her running mate, Governor Tim Walz, who said it should be left up to the individual states. But aside from Vice President Harris's recent comments, her presidential campaign platform has not yet formally adopted her stance. Now let's head back to British Columbia, Canada, and chat with the guys from Chase, BC, who make craft cannabis.
I'm Rudi Schiebel. I'm the CEO and founder of Habitat Life Sciences.
Mind-blowing is the word I use a lot when talking about Habitat Life. Aquaponics isn't a new thing, but because of the nature of Prohibition, what they were doing was pretty unheard of. During Prohibition, most people didn't want to invest a lot of money into their facilities for obvious reasons. You can tell just by speaking to him, Rudi's got a high level vision of where he wanted to go and where the industry is going. When he was getting started, his model wasn't exactly proven for cannabis. You got to be pretty brave to jump in and start growing the way he did.
Rudi also doesn't work alone.
My name's Justin Henry, and I'm a fish nerd, I guess.
That's selling himself short. Justin Henry is the aquaculture whiz that Rudi Schiebel brought on to get the system up and running. Specifically, the tanks that the salmon all go into. He makes the magic happen.
I was working in the aquaculture industry for decades, and Rudi Schiebel called me up one day and wanted to have a meeting. I just ventured into the consulting phase of my career, and Rudi said that he was growing cannabis, or was planning a cannabis farm, and had this idea that he wanted to do it aquaponically. So he wanted to have fish and cannabis growing in the same facility. But he didn't know anything about fish. I thought it was a little bit crazy, but it was interesting too. So we met for lunch one day, and after that meeting decided to give it a try.
But let's go back even further. Rudi didn't start out growing cannabis.
Before we talk more about habitat, let's go back to your first entrepreneurial experience. Tell us a bit about Turtle Valley Bison.
Yeah, so that was really my inauguration into farming. So it was my first business, but it was also my accidental entrance into agriculture. Agriculture was never something that I thought I would end up in, but had the opportunity to buy some farmland in British Columbia, and through that process looked at what we could do to have a revenue generating property, and discovered bison through our searches of what we wanted to potentially run on there. Dove in with both feet. Like anything, agriculture becomes a 7-day-a-week endeavor, and really opened my eyes to, one, the opportunities in sustainable agriculture, but then also just the sheer need to have sustainable and high quality agricultural products in the market today.
Now, I've been out to Habitat and Turtle Valley, and I have to say, those animals are majestic and they're big, and we got pretty close to them. I just have to ask you, have you ever tried to get on one?
No, I haven't tried. I've been chased by them. We've had scenarios where we had extra calves or orphan calves that we had to go and rescue out of the herd, so we had to kind of jump in there, grab them, and then bail into the back of pickup trucks while some of the herds were chasing us. The moms were chasing us out of the field because they all have the herd mentality and try to protect. So yeah, that's about as close that you really want to get to them.
No kidding. That's incredible. What first interested you in the cannabis industry?
The guy that I founded the Bison Ranch with had a background in the medical cannabis space. And as the legalization came forward through to the recreational side, there was the opportunity to get licensing, and that opportunity was brought forward to me to participate in that. And my caveat to it was looking at indoor agriculture and cannabis and just looking how resource intensive it is with energy, nutrients, water, and really wanting to incorporate a sustainable agriculture approach to that. And that was really the starting point of the idea around aquaponics and how we could make indoor cultivation a bit more sustainable and multifaceted. And then we really went full force on that, brought on Justin Henry, who was the best in the field in terms of the aquaculture side and salmon production.
My expertise is not on the cannabis side. I've been in the aquaculture space for 30 years. I studied aquaculture back at the University of British Columbia a long time ago, and then went on to study aquaculture biotechnology at Aalborg University in Denmark. Eventually, I came back to British Columbia and started a career in aquaculture. I think I'm a fish nerd because of my dad, who brought us fishing and camping when we were little. When I was 4 years old, started fishing, and really interested and passionate about the fish and trying to learn about them and trying to grow them in aquariums at my house, when I was a kid. And then eventually, when I was studying, I wanted to be a veterinarian. I went into pre-veterinary school and and was studying that at UBC. Then we had to specialize in some type of animal. And one of the options was fish. And I thought, well, that's a no-brainer. Like, that's the most interesting one, so I'll focus on that. And then going to veterinary school, I couldn't just keep focusing on fish. You had to go start back at the beginning and do all of the different animals to start vet school. Well, I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to work with chickens and the other animals. So instead, I found a different path. Instead of vet school, can I continue to study aquaculture somewhere? And I found somewhere in Denmark where I could do that. It wasn't some point where I thought, hey, this is what I'm going to do. It just always kept leading down that path. The reason I wanted to get into it on the education side was to make sure that we had all these fish in the future, like concerns about wild salmon stocks and stuff like that. I thought this would be the best path to make sure that my kids and my grandkids are going to have these fish out in the wild. So that was the path that I chose.
We really wanted to focus that the salmon side of the business was going to be its own business, not just looking at it as the nutrient source of our cannabis. So we brought him on, we designed the system, we spent a few years developing that, killing a lot of plants, trying to get that whole program to work. Through the years, we really refined it down to where it's at now and producing really high quality and really good cannabis.
If you can sum up in a few sentences what Habitat is, what would it be?
I would say that it's a sustainable farming model. I think that's first and foremost why we do what we do. And then what we produce comes out of that. Like any sort of agricultural model is what are you producing? And then how do you produce it? So for us, it's coho salmon and craft cannabis under our Cake and Caviar brand. Habitat is a aquaponics company. What we mean by that is we have an aquaculture component to our business, which is a salmon farm that produces coho salmon, and that's the aqua part of aquaponics. And then we have the cannabis side of our business, which is growing in deep water culture in all the water and nutrient-rich water that comes from the coho salmon farm, which is the ponics side of our program. So together that's aquaponics, and we really run a multifaceted or symbiotic farm.
Aquaponics is the combined production of fish and plants, or seaweed in some cases, in a complementary system that's linked by water and the microbial community.
We brought Justin Henry onto the show specifically to get into the nitty-gritty and the surprisingly deep story.
Aquaponics is a term that a lot of people don't know, that they haven't heard of. And it is really something that's emerging, although it's been around for a long time. So if you think back of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, for example, they're using aquaponics there, or the Aztec chinampas, or rice fields in China. For thousands of years, people have been carrying out aquaponics. Sort of more recently, but a few decades back, it started to get commercialized, and that started at the University of the Virgin Islands, where they were growing lettuce in something that would maybe typically look like a hydroponic system, but then they had a couple of tanks of tilapia at the end of it, and then using the nutrients from those fish for the plants. So that really started to develop over the past couple of decades, where more and more of those came out. A lot of them are hobby farm size of facilities, but they're all focused on the plant and then adding some fish on the end of it. Fish are like people in that they consume oxygen and feed and water, and they produce ammonia and solid waste and carbon dioxide. So in what's called a recirculating aquaculture system, in a system where you're growing fish in tanks on land and you want to recycle and reuse the water, you need to just filter out those things that they produce, the ammonia, the carbon dioxide, and the solid wastes. So that technology has developed quite a bit really over the past 20 years, it had a slow rise, and there's a lot of interest in that technology now. And maybe by coincidence, but just an interesting part of it is that those things that we're stripping out, which is the ammonia and the carbon dioxide and the solids, those are used for inputs for growing plants. So the idea with aquaponics is that you can combine these two things together. We have a fish system, and then we have a plant system, and in between is sort of where the magic happens, is what we call a mineralization system. We can filter out the solids from the fish system, and then we digest those, and it essentially makes the nutrients available for the plants. So then we send that water to the plants, and that's how we grow the plants. And it can be pretty much any plant, really. What we can do is take the inputs for the fish, which are some feed and water, and then the outputs, those go as food for the plants. You can then send that water back to the fish again after the plants have essentially cleaned out the nutrients, and then you can reuse it.
We use a technology called recirculating aquaculture systems. What that means is we're recirculating about 99.7% of the water within the fish farm at any given time. So we're treating the ammonia, which is turning into nitrate. We're treating the CO2, and we're using UV and ozone to oxygenate and treat the microbial life within the water so that the salmon are always in the highest quality water that is possible, because salmon are very sensitive to the environment that they're in. So we need to have essentially perfect parameters to grow salmon in a closed system. What that allows us to do in a closed system is actually to capture all of that nutrient waste that comes from the uneaten feed and the manure that comes from the fish production, as well as the ammonia that's produced from them respiring. And so that really forms the basis of the nutrient solution that then gets pumped over to the cannabis side, where we're growing in about 10 inches of water.
You might remember that Justin mentioned it earlier. This is called deep water culture. It's a method of growing plants with their roots submerged in nutrient-rich water instead of soil, allowing them to absorb nutrients more directly.
So it's deep water culture. So we have no soil, no media. The roots are just growing directly into water. As the plants drink the water, we top up the water. We do augmentation to the water, whether that's pH, adding in potassium, things like that don't come from the aquaculture side. And the plants uptake the vast majority of the nitrogen that we produce from the fish system.
I've been there a few times over the years, and what always is impressive to me is how large the biomass of the root balls are in the water. I mean, they're literally the size of like a mop, just sucking up all the nutrients. It's incredible.
What sets Habitat's system apart from other aquaponics facilities?
So at Habitat, we approached it a little bit differently. We said, let's create an optimal facility for the fish, and then we can add the plants as well. So really, it's trying to create an optimal facility for both the plants and the fish. There are two different types of facilities. So one is called a coupled facility, and one is decoupled. To make some sense out of it, I'll just briefly talk about in a fish system, a recirculating aquaculture system. You remove the solids, which is fish feces and uneaten feed, and you have like a screen filter to mechanically remove those. And then you have a biological filter where you're growing bacteria, and those bacteria consume the ammonia, and they end up producing nitrate, which is the nitrogen that plants are taking up. And then you're stripping out carbon dioxide from the water, and then you're disinfecting the water and sending it back to the fish. So on a coupled aquaponics facility, the plants are really just one more filter in that series of filters. So the plants would then take up that nitrate that the biological filter is producing, and the water just keeps going through the system. The water goes then back to the fish. In a decoupled system, you have this recirculation system with all these filters for the fish, and then you also have a recirculation system for the plants. And you just are sending the solids that you take out using the microscreen filter. You move those solids over to a digester, and then those nutrients become the most available for the plants. You separate out the solids then, and you have a nice clear liquid that's high in nutrients, and you send that to the fish. As you're stripping out the CO2, you can send that over to the plant room as well. So you're reusing all of these things that are in the past have been wasted from a fish facility, and you can use all of those things. Now, the scale at Habitat on the fish side, first of all, it works really, really well, but the scale by itself is too small, really to be an independent business. And that's where, we're looking at the scale up of it. But when I think about aquaponics and look at data from lots of different research that's carried out in aquaponics on a variety of plants, when you really get it dialed in, you can see quite a significant benefit in terms of health and growth of the plant in these systems. They are tricky to get dialed in, but once you do that, I think there are some pretty significant benefits. From my perspective, also on the aquaculture side, I'm always looking to try to capture nutrients that are lost. So I don't want to waste anything. So we look at all of these nutrients in the feces, for example, that can be used. And in a lot of aquaculture, there's no ability to capture those. So in these aquaponics systems and in the system at Habitat, we can capture that. And so once you've got it, then you have to figure out what's the best use for it. You can use it directly in an aquaponics system, or you can capture it and use it in a traditional terrestrial agriculture system. The location of the Habitat facility is right in the middle of agriculture land. So there is a lot of crop production that you can use the nutrients in that as well. Good water quality is the key to lots of agriculture in plants and for sure with fish. The system, though, can produce very good water quality. Even if your incoming water isn't perfect, you have that ability to amend and filter it to get that water quality. The reason that's possible is because such a high percentage of water that's filtered and recirculated in the system, the actual new water, the makeup water, is a very small percentage of the flow. In the system at Habitat, we filter and reuse about 99.5% of the water. So the makeup water is just a tiny percentage of the flow, 0.5% or so of the flow of the system.
So it really highlights the circular nature of the system, reusing waste and reusing water to benefit both sides of the production. You have to believe this kind of thing is one of the best solutions in the long run for the environment, and it just makes sense being where Habitat is located. The interior of BC is technically a desert.
In a desert, why would you use such a system that's water-based? The reality is that the amount of water used in this system is far, far less than in other types of culture systems. Significantly less water would be used in this system than, for example, a terrestrial system, or if you were growing the plants in soil in any type of system, this will use much less water than that. And you can have these systems pretty much anywhere and then focus on how you'll continually reduce water use. Probably there's some evaporation of water, but nothing like the evaporation experience when watering soil.
As scientific an operation that you can have, I've never seen anything like it out there. Mm-hmm. Is this process better for the environment in general, or is it just more efficient?
Where it's at right now, it's not perfect in terms of we still use a large amount of energy being an indoor cultivator. So we still have to power our lights and all our controls and circulate the water. But what we are doing is being very water efficient, and we're being very nitrogen efficient. So in terms of needing to buy fertilizers or have fertilizer waste, we have both of those kind of really dialed in, as well as the CO2 that's produced from the production of protein, which really all protein production creates CO2 output. By growing next to plants, plants really like CO2. So we can really kind of have a CO2 sink from that side and create as close to a carbon neutral protein source in salmon as we possibly can by being able to utilize that symbiotic relationship. So from those aspects, it's really sustainable. And then obviously we're always trying to improve and find that next level of how can we make this more sustainable, more adoptable by other farmers, and how can we see both the salmon side of the business and the cultivation side of the business expand beyond even what we're doing. So that's a big focus of kind of the parent company or Habitat Life Sciences side of the business.
So what effect does this type of farming have on the end product of salmon and the production of cannabis?
Well, it's a decoupled system. So the production of salmon is very isolated to the protocols and procedures of how we run the fish farm. And we have that very dialed in, and the quality of the product that comes out of that is top notch. We have people all over who just love the product and want to see us grow more of the product, which is something that we're always looking to do. Really what we're doing is harvesting the nutrient from the fish farm. And so the cannabis side is in its own isolated one-way street of the water flowing to the cannabis side. And then just as the water is consumed, we replace that. And like I said, make those adjustments. So there really isn't an interaction the other way. So we have no effect from the fish, so to speak, on the cannabis. Some people ask, do you ever get any like fish flavor through to the cannabis? That's not really how that works. It's just the nutrients that's been released into the water. And same back to the salmon. There's no interaction with the cannabis plants, so there's no potential for any sort of contamination. I guess what people are concerned about whether there's THC in the fish at all.
The reason that you would decouple a facility, even though it's a lot more complicated to build and operate, you can really dial in the parameters. So if the fish and plants are living in the same water, then you have to have the same pH and the same water quality parameters. And perhaps you're sacrificing, a little bit on both sides. But if you decouple it, you can have optimal parameters for the fish on one side and then optimal parameters for the plants on the other side. The salmon from Habitat is really impressive. I've eaten fish my whole life and tried all the species of salmon, and the quality of coho salmon that they produce is the best that I've had. The flavor is beautiful, it's clean, just the right oil content. The fish look beautiful, the pigment's really nice. It's a really impressive fish. Unfortunately, they don't produce a huge amount of it. So it's, not something that's readily available around the market. Unless you're there locally, then it's available. But it's something that Habitat's working on now. How do we scale up the fish portion of it? How do we expand that portion of it and really make that product more available across the country?
We sell at farm gate, so people can come pick it up from the farm. And then we sell it through Fisherman's Market in Kamloops, and then to certain select chefs in the area.
How is the waste from the salmon processed and added to the cannabis to grow?
So there are 8 fish tanks in the room. 6 of them are for production tanks and 2 are for finishing for the fish before you harvest them. And these tanks are about 5,000 liters for each tank. I don't know if that sounds big or small to people, but for aquaculture, that's pretty small. And we're growing fish in those tanks throughout their entire life cycle. You'll see a lot of pipes leading out of that fish room. The water from the fish go into another room, which we call the mineralization room. First, it runs through a drum filter, microscreen drum filter, where the solids are separated out. That's the feces and uneaten feed. And then the water goes through a biological filter where it's just growing bacteria, and these bacteria are nitrifying bacteria. They consume the ammonia in the water and produce nitrate. The reason that you need that is because ammonia builds up and it can become toxic for the fish. Then the water gets aerated, so we're stripping out the carbon dioxide that the fish produce. We're adding oxygen to the water. We're adding ozone to the water as well for disinfection. Then we pump that water back to the fish room, goes through a UV filter, and then through a chiller, which is cooling the water down, and then it goes back to the fish. Now, beside that mineralization system in that same room, those solids, the feces and uneaten feed, goes into a large tank, which is a digester. So we have to aerate that, and we're growing bacteria in there that are breaking down that feces and making the nutrients most available for the plants. Then out of that digester, we separate the feces from the water, which just through settling, and then that high nutrient clear liquid flows off of there and then gets pumped to the plant rooms. There are 6 plant rooms, and each one is on its own small recirculation system. So the water gets topped up from the mineralization system to each plant room, and it works really well.
Do you add any nutrients to that plant food or anything, or is it just 100% from the salmon?
Well, it's not 100% from the salmon, but 100% of the nitrogen, calcium, and magnesium can come from the salmon side of the program. So we capture the uneaten waste and manure, and we use bacterial life aerobic digestion to break that down, like essentially into a liquid compost that releases all the nutrients into the water, breaks it down into a liquid soil. Then we filter that and treat that so it's clear water and doesn't have any issues of clogging the hydroponic system. And then that gets fed directly to our plants.
Now, the whole time we've been talking about fertilizer, the question has probably crossed your mind.
Does fish poop smell?
Don't worry, we asked Justin.
The answer is, it depends. For fish poop, or probably any type of poop, this is going into a digester. Now, there are different types of digesters. If you have an anaerobic digester, which means you don't have oxygen in it and you're mixing it and it's digesting, that works really well if you want to produce methane, which you can then burn for biogas. And that smells really, really bad. Ugh. In this case, at Habitat's facility, it's an aerobic digester. So we're adding air and oxygen to the digester. And in that case, the poop doesn't smell bad. It just smells like soil. It's quite nice.
In the industry right now, it's pretty difficult to get an organic certification for cannabis, but Habitat has that organic certification under the Aquatic Act. How does that affect your retail, and what does that mean to your brand?
There's a couple sides to that. Yeah, we were the first cannabis company to be certified under a national standard. So there's 2 standards, as terrestrial and the aquaculture standard. And so we were able to get certified under the aquaculture standard. A lot of what we built around our brand has been around the aquaponics and how we grow. And we thought that the organic side of it would allow us to fetch a premium. But so far, that hasn't really been the case. We've been subject to kind of the same price compressions and competitive environment that exists in the Canadian cannabis space right now, as I'm sure you feel as well.
Yes, buddy. I feel your pain.
So most of the organic stuff, actually, the benefits come from the salmon side of the business, from the food. People really value it in the food and didn't really seem to value it in the cannabis side of the business, which was quite an interesting finding for us. But what it did do was it brought attention to us internationally. And so we had people reach out to us from Germany, the UK, and Australia. And now the majority of our business is in export and really around the story of aquaponics and how we grow in doing that. So I think the benefit came into the fact that we were able to stand out and really be one of the first craft producers exporting, which seems to be picking up steam now.
Well, having spent some time in Europe myself, I can imagine the organic certification definitely pulls some weight. Now, as far as your strains, why don't you run through the strains that you guys produce?
Yeah, our main flagship is the Waffle Bites. That's our cake lineage, which is what our name was based off of. We had 2 main cultivars that stemmed into the breeding program that we had, and that was Cake and Caviar and the genetic bank that we had. And so we just carried that forward into Habitat's endeavors. Yeah, the most of what we've put out has come from that line. So Waffle Bites is, for the most part, the sole one that we're growing right now to just keep up with the demand of export. Mm-hmm. But we do have one that we run interchangeably called Gunpowder Milkshake, which is kind of the caviar diversion of the Waffle Bites. It's a very trichome dense flower, a bit smaller buds, but has a very creamy mix with GMO kind of smell to it, which is where the Gunpowder Milkshake name came from.
Sounds smooth.
Both of them are very smooth and both are quite potent. Like we test around the 25 to 28% on those pretty regularly and more on the 28% range for the most part. So right now we have a bank of a lot of other genetics, but we've just found that we've been able to dial those in and service those two cultivars, and we haven't had much capacity for the other ones quite at this time. Blueberry Yum Yum was a fan favorite that we grew.
I love that one.
And still do interchangeably. We actually have a partner grower that's growing that now for us, going out under a craft line that separates a bit from our aquaponics line, but people just loved some of our genetics and we wanted to give them access to that. So we partnered with some other craft growers and created the best of BC growers line on that we're just working on launching. So we'll be able to keep Blueberry Yum Yum rolling, maybe bring Lemon Loaf back.
Oh yeah.
And then maybe introduce some new cultivars coming up here that I think people can get excited about.
That's pretty exciting. Now, just on average, where do you think your terps fall?
On average, they're around 3%.
Yeah.
We've hit as high as 4%, and we do get sometimes around the 2.5%. But sometimes that comes from more of like the drying process.
I'm a big terps guy, so I know cake and caviar, the terps are present, and it's pretty obvious what you guys are doing out there as far as quality is concerned. Is cannabis produced using aquaponics better than other types of cannabis? Does it differentiate itself a little bit that way?
There's a lot of factors, as you know, that impact the quality of cannabis. I think there's a few from growing in deep water culture. Some of the areas that we really see a divergence is just the sheer rate of growth that happens in the deep water culture. So that initial 3 weeks of vegetative growth until we kind of do that initial defull is it's insane. It's really hard to keep up with.
So for our listeners, the defull, that's a defoliation. You know, you kind of de-leaf it a little bit, maybe do some pruning, and then that creates a little bit of a growth spurt in the plants. The bioavailability of the nutrients in the deep water culture, personally, I think is superior than other types of growing mediums. So that most likely has a little bit to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's direct. They have no interference, so they can just take up whatever they want. And so it really leads to rapid growth. And then I think from there, the balance, your environmentals, and managing kind of the whole range of what drives cannabis is really what drives the quality out of it. And so I think apples to apples, if you have all that within deep water culture, then you can grow really high quality cannabis. And I think that it drives a bit of a more trichome dense, more terpene rich flower, which for most people equates to higher quality. Mm-hmm. But again, just growing in aquaponics or DWC doesn't mean that you'll end up with high quality cannabis. You have to have the whole program with it. Same thing with the salmon side. Creating an environment in a farm where your animals are really healthy and happy is key to having a high quality product that comes out the other end. So everything we've done is to produce a high quality product, and I think it's equivalent. We can put it up against any sort of wild salmon that people bring forward, and we have, and people have selected our salmon over wild salmon in a few different cases. So that's been pretty fun to see.
So using this method is like hitting two birds with one stone. You produce food and cannabis in the same place, which is super efficient for the environment. But what about the cost?
That's one of the main pillars, I would say, to sustainability, right? If it's not economically sustainable, then it's not going to be sustainable long term. You still, in agriculture, you have to make money at what you're growing, or else you're not going to be growing it for very long. So the salmon side of the business requires scale like most food production does in order for it to be really economical on its own standing, which is a big part of the project of what we're working on, is how to go from the 4 tons of production that we're doing now with plans to do the next farm, which is going to be about 300 metric tons of production. That's been a really exciting project that we've been working on, and something that kind of diverges a little bit away from cannabis, because obviously we won't be scaling the cannabis side of the business up to that same extent, but that gives us opportunities to incorporate the salmon side with other types of agriculture, more traditional types, whether that's field crops by irrigating in the summer and getting that nitrogen into the soil, or greenhouse production, things like that. But from the cannabis side, like I think everybody in the space, we've had a fun few years of trying to find a balance and find a path to a successful business in that. And I think this year, with the export coming online, last year we were just slightly profitable, and this year we're going to be even more profitable. So things are looking good on that side. The cannabis side with what we're doing, and just being able to differentiate has proven to be a model that's working for us.
That's the name of the game. To highlight the safety of consuming the salmon coming out of that environment, to me it sounds like it would be way more controlled than, say, a wild salmon just swimming around in the ocean. Who knows what they come across during that journey. But in your situation, you have like an enclosed system. You know exactly what's in the water. You know exactly what they're eating. And then, of course, the end product. I mean, you're pretty much producing like the highest level salmon that you might find in sushi, for example. Am I correct in assuming that?
Yeah. A lot of salmon, whether you're buying it from the marine farms or wild salmon, is you need to make sure that it's been frozen first to make sure there's no parasites or anything in it. Our fish, when it comes out of the finishing tank, you can eat it right then and there. There's no risk of any parasites because we have a controlled environment. In terms of the water quality, we're always maintaining our water quality. We know exactly what's in our water. So any of the concerns around heavy metals, microplastics, things like that, that people are concerned about within our oceans, from our oceans being so polluted, or to your point, you don't know where those salmon swam or where their range is. They can end up swimming by Fukushima and then
there you go,
coming back and spawning, and then you're eating that salmon. So in terms of the quality, yeah, I think it's probably the highest and safest quality that you could have in regards to traceability and food security.
So you get the highest quality salmon, and you get the highest from smoking cake and caviar.
Rudi and the key people there at Habitat have a really interesting vision, and I really look forward to this next stage on the fish side, on how they're developing a platform which really they think will enable the launch or the emergence of land-based salmon production here in Canada and in other countries.
There's a reason why people like Rudi have a place in this industry. He earned it. It's a common denominator in everybody that's still around. Resilience. You've got to have resilience to stay in this game. You've got to have the passion for cannabis, even when it doesn't really make sense from a financial standpoint. It's a tricky business, but if you persevere and don't give up, it's kind of like sports. The guys that want it the most are going to get it. Aquaponics is just one way of growing cannabis, but there's probably a half a dozen equally good other ways to do it. It's just a matter of picking your method and then perfecting it and mastering whatever it is. Whether you're doing deep water culture, aquaponics, living soil, aeroponics, whatever, you just got to find one that works for you and then stick with it, because it's an art. Each one is an art form in itself.
That was Rudi Schiebel, CEO and founder of Habitat Life, and Justin Henry, Habitat's aquaculture advisor. They're focused on responsible production because we're using up resources like fresh water and energy and nutrients quickly, more than the global generation rate allows. And in an extraction industry like fishing, we're taking much more than we need. So in turn, we turn to people like Rudi and Justin to provide an alternative solution that'll take some of the pressure off and just let the earth do its thing. And in the meantime, have some sustainably sourced salmon and cannabis. See what else they're doing for their community and the environment by visiting them online at habitat.life. The podcast with Ross Rebagliati is an Everything Podcast production in partnership with Ripco.pro. The opinions expressed in this podcast are not necessarily the views of the podcast team or our partners. This show is intended for a 19-plus audience. Our host is Ross Rebagliati, showrunner Karen Habashi, our writers Jordan Wong, and our sound engineer is John Massacre. I'm Don Schaefer. Thanks for listening to the podcast, the authority on cannabis innovation and culture. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Another Everything Podcast production. Visit everythingpodcast.com, a division of Pattison Media. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast.